After I made the third video in my series about how to work with colour and your post-processing tools, it occurred to me that it might not be a bad idea to do a video about colour theory. And I've made two, in fact. So there's this one that you're watching now. This is a theoretical video exploring what colour science is, what is meant by colour theory, what are the components of colour theory, what tools can we use to help us to understand and extrapolate meaning from colour theory. And the second video will go into how we can actually, in practical terms, use our knowledge of colour theory in our processing and in our photography as well. Okay, so let's get into it. Now, what do we mean by science initially? Because this is going to clear up some of the sort of, voodoo and misconceptions around colour theory. What science is basically observation. It's essentially extrapolating meaning from observing things that happen in the real world, and recognizing patterns and recognizing and abstracting that into a series of observations that can be applied to various different circumstances to produce a result that's consistent. So what we're going to do with colour theory is initially point out that colour schemes, which are basically the currency of colour theory, are to be found in nature and in the built environment all around us. They're not something that we dream up. Now, having said that, there are professions that are dedicated to dreaming up harmonious colour schemes, so interior design being the obvious one. But marketing, advertising, films really lean heavily on colour theory in order to bring out certain characteristics that have been observed. So apart from the ways that colours support one another, which can be described in the colour wheel, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but we're going to have a look at the Adobe colour wheel in some detail later on. But there is also a psychological element. So colours and mean certain things, and this is somewhat culture specific, so this is kind of social science in a sense, but we're talking really in the broadest possible terms of the difference between warm colours and cold colours. So warm colours are red, orange, green. Cold colours, blue, anything on the blue spectrum. And these produce a feeling, whether you like it or not, in the images that you're working on. So if we want to make our picture seem more approachable, more friendly, more happy, more uplifting, we tend to warm it up. If we want to make it colder, more aloof, conjure up a different kind of atmosphere, we can cool it down. Now, atmosphere is not the only thing that we're dealing with in colour theory. There are a lot of other pieces as well. So the first thing I want to talk about probably is the notion of harmonious colour schemes. Okay, so what I want to do with this section, I'm going to introduce you to the Adobe Color Wheel. This is a free website that I find immensely useful. And you can use this, you can upload your own photographs to it, and it will tell you what the principal colors are. And from there you can see whether or how close to an existing color scheme the picture is, but we're racing ahead of ourselves. Let's first of all get into the colour scheme. So I'm going to illustrate these with the colour wheel initially, and then with a photograph that matches the colour scheme, so that you can see the theory and the real life application. Okay, so there are really three colour schemes that are particularly common in photography. The first one is monochromatic, and what monochromatic means, I'm sure you'll be able to guess. It's shades of a single colour. Black and white is in fact a monochromatic colour scheme, but also shots taken in the desert, for example, where everything is a shade of yellow to brown. Where do you see it? You see it in fashion photography a lot. Landscape photography, the monochromatic schemes occur quite naturally in landscapes, so think of forests, a continuum from green through to brown. These are called monochromatic colour schemes. And you'll see that the monochromatic scheme, effectively the colours line up in a straight line on the colour wheel. So you're literally going from a shade at the outside, a vivid representation at the outside, all the way through to the other extreme for that particular tone. The next one is analogous or analogous colour schemes. I'm never quite sure how you pronounce that. So analogous, no doubt somebody will correct me. So what these involve is colours that are operating in adjacent areas of the colour wheel. So if I have my principal colour is yellow, then the adjacent colours green and orange. Where do we find these? Again, landscape photography quite often. We find them in street photography a lot, abstract photography. Okay, so the next one that we're really concerned with so far as photography is concerned is the complementary colour scheme. Now what this relies on is using colours that are opposite one another on the colour wheel. Okay, so teal and orange is a really good example of a complementary colour scheme that we've seen used in countless films and countless photographs. And if you find an example of this in real life, street photography, definitely landscape photography occasionally, especially where there's a sky involved. The last one that well, it's not the last one, but the other one that is probably worth really having a good close look at is called split complementary. And what split complementary is, it's kind of a cross between complementary and analogous. So you take your one colour on one side of the colour wheel, and then you go the opposite side of the colour wheel, adopting an analogous scheme. So instead of the colour immediately opposite, you'll have colours from the adjacent sections. Okay, so where do we see this? We see this in street photography quite a lot, a little bit in landscape photography, a lot in photographs that include some human element into the landscape. Okay, now other ones that we probably need to be aware of, triadic, this is three positions on the colour wheel that make up a triangle. So it's neither complementary nor analogous. The spots are separated. And the last one that I think is really worth having a look at is quadratic. And as you can probably guess, this is 4 spots on the colour wheel that are more or less equally separated and distributed. Now, when you get into these, I mean, again, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but just a hint or a tip for those of you that are going to try putting some of this into practice. when you get into these colour schemes that contain multiple colours and multiple different points on the colour wheel, it helps to think in terms of a dominant colour. And so if you were to take, let's say, a quadratic colour scheme and increase the saturation across the board as a global adjustment, you're going to end up with a very jarring piece. So the thing to do is to go with a dominant colour and perhaps reduce the luminance or reduce the saturation of some of the other colours in that scheme, so that you're guiding the viewer's eye in this case. So that's an example of the kind of thing that we'll be talking about a lot in the next video. So at this point, I think it's probably wise to talk about the characteristics of colour. So what is the difference between a dark blue and a light blue, between a saturated blue and a desaturated blue? Well, there are three things that control every characteristic of colour. They are hue, which is the colour itself, blue, yellow, orange, green. Those are all hues. There is the saturation, which refers to the intensity of the colour. So a very saturated red is a very intense colour that actually stands out a mile in a photograph. And there is the luminosity, the luminance of the colour. Now, what that means is the amount of effectively brightness that's applied to that colour. Now, these three characteristics you'll be familiar with from the sliders in your Lightroom or your photo lab, or whatever you happen to be using. And I'm sure that you will have noticed by now that they appear to be linked in some mysterious way. And it's not really mysterious. I've often complained in my videos about the way that contrast, for example, has an effect on colours. And it's one of the reasons that I don't like using global contrast, particularly because it tends to affect the colours throughout the image. You might not be noticing it because you might be looking at a particular area of the image, whack up the contrast a little bit, and before you know it, your sky's got a funny colour, or whatever. One of the reasons I don't use it that much. But hue, saturation and luminance are definitely linked. So if we increase the luminance of a colour, then we're really sort of watering it down. You're making it brighter, but you're also making it lighter, if that makes sense. So you're pushing more light into that colour. If you change the saturation of a colour, again, that changes the tone of the colour substantially. So one way of visualising where hue, saturation and luminance sit is to have a good look at the colour picker tool in Photoshop. Okay, so to have a look at how these values actually affect colour, I'm going to use the Adobe Photoshop and I'm going to use the colour picker tool in order to demonstrate this, because it makes things much clearer, I think, than this kind of display does. So let's load the colour picker tool, and what we've got here, I'll just move this into the center. What we've got here is a big square, and the big square represents saturation and brightness, saturation and luminance. The slider here represents hue. So if I move my slider here, you can see it changing through red, orange, green, blue, purple, and back to red again. So it's kind of circular in that sense, but you're representing all of the colors that are defined that Adobe Photoshop supports here. And if we move this slider from left to right, we're increasing the saturation. So we're getting to a saturated red. If we increase the luminance, we move it up, and you're getting to a brighter saturated red. We move it to the left. We're desaturating it, but it's still very bright. Move it down. We're taking the brightness away, and we're moving into the realm of murk and mud, basically. Move it across, increasing the saturation, take it up, increasing the brightness. Okay, so this is a really good, for me, I think at least, is a really good way of understanding how saturation and luminance and hue interact to give us lots of different colours and different shades, tones, etc. So if I were to move this down here, I'm almost getting a brown. You can see that there. And similarly, if we take this away from the reds, move it into the blues, then here we're getting a sort of mauve kind of a colour. So it's associated obviously with the hue blue, but it's a completely different colour. And right up here it's pure white. Right down here, pure black. Here, pure black. And just as an aside here, you can see that these colours are represented not only in the hexadecimal, but also in the RGB and the HSB scale. These are the ones that are likely to be useful. So it would be unwise to go much further with this without mentioning colour spaces. Now, what is a colour space? A colour space is an envelope, if you like, that contains a set number of colours. It's boundaries within the entire visible spectrum. Now, the reason we have colour spaces is to map onto technical advances. So the requirements of a printer, of a camera, of a computer, of a television screen are all very different. And so this concept of colour spaces has arisen. Now, the ones that are of interest to photographers, starting from the smallest colour space, so the least number of colours, is sRGB. And this is really used as the output for anything that goes on the web, and the reason that it's still used as the output for anything that goes on the web is that if your picture were to be defined in, let's say, Adobe RGB, travels across the internet and somebody is watching it or looking at it on an antique computer with an antique, I say antique, but I'm talking about 5 years, computer screen that couldn't deal with that colour space, then you're relying on that person's computer to do the conversion. And that means it's going to take an arbitrary view, or a view that makes mathematical sense to the computer, to crush the colours and recast some of the colours into the nearest possible equivalent. Now, what that translates to is that you're risking that your photograph that you've worked so hard on to get the colours right is going to look like mush on somebody's antique or antiquated computer. So none of us want that. That's the reason that we do the sRGB conversion at the end of our workflow. The next one up is probably Adobe RGB. This is what we routinely set our cameras to, and the logic here, you might be thinking, why don't we set our cameras to sRGB? The logic here is that you might be printing, for one thing. Printing is able to represent more colours than your antiquated computer screen. And it makes sense from the editing perspective. to control the way that these colours are articulated ultimately in sRGB. So if you start with Adobe RGB, you've got the full gamut. You can use all of the colours, and then you can have a look at it when it's converted into sRGB, see if there's anything that you might want to tweak. But Adobe RGB is the standard, I think, for the way that we set our cameras. Now, above that, or with more colours than that, there is DxO wide gamut. Now, DxO wide gamut is particular to DxO software. It's a bigger space than Adobe RGB. You would still be converting your photograph to sRGB at the end of the workflow, but it will give you more access to more colours. And if you've got a highly specific output for your workflow that, for example, depends on Apple, the latest Apple computer monitor, or widescreen TV with a massive colour space supported, that's why you might choose to use DxO wide gamut as an output variable as well. The biggest one is Apple P3, and it's Apple P3 that really caused the invention of the DxO wide gamut, because Apple P3 is a format that is widely used for cinematography and represents the biggest colour space that we commonly talk about. Okay, so how does this manifest itself? Well, it manifests itself in the vividness and the range, the depth of the things that you're watching on the television. I'm not going to go into bit depth for the purpose of this discussion. I think that's probably a step too far, but that is where we start talking about 4K, 5K and 6K, 224 bit depth. More important for video, I think, than photography, so let's not go there. We're just going to make things even more complicated. So that's the concept of colour spaces, and the key thing to remember with colour spaces is that colour spaces are a reflection of the current state of technology, and in our choices, for example, the choice of converting our output into sRGB for web use, in our choices we should be cognizant of the purpose of the image that you're outputting. I wanted to talk briefly about the psychology of colour, because this too is important, and it really helps to determine our choices about the way that we use colour in our photography, the colours that we want to emphasise, what we want to have as dominant colours, and so on. So this absolutely bleeds into things like set design. If you're a studio photographer, that sort of activity leans very heavily into behavioural psychology. So let's have a look at the headlines here. So broadly speaking, we've already alluded to warm and cool. So the warm colours, red, orange, yellow, the cool colours, the blues, mean something that's fairly obvious, if you like. So the blue colours are sort of cold, analytical. Warm colours are warm, sensual, and happy, sad. We can add onto this certain cultural cues as well that it's good to be aware of, but not necessarily, take as the gospel truth. But if we go through the colours, so if you're looking at red, you've got passion, you've got excitement. In some cultures, you've got danger. Red is also a colour that we find in nature that often signifies danger. So red berries, for example, are very often poisonous. So that's something that's a real deeply embedded flag, if you like. We use the term red flag for a reason. Blue, you've got coolness, you've got trust, stability. If you look at the way that blue is used in corporate branding, I used to work for an IT company who were known as Big Blue, and the reason that they covered all of their branding in blue was everything that was down to stability, down to trust, and so on. Green colours, nature, again, you can lean into, because we're layering on top of this a sort of cultural significance. Now you've got the green movement, so you can layer values of trust, natural stuff, the truth on top of green. Also, you used to have the expression green with envy, which is worth bearing in mind as well. So those are your RGB values. And let's have a look at this next chart, which will give us a breakdown of many more values that are layered on top of these colours. It's important to remember when we talk about colour theory in this context, the feelings and connotations of various colours on people, that this is not, so far as photography is concerned, this is not a literal science. This doesn't mean that a yellow photograph is going to fill you with hope and joy. What it means is that it's undeniable that when you stand in front of a photograph, it makes you feel a certain way. When you stand in front of a landscape, it makes you feel a certain way. And the art in photography is to try to capture the way that it makes you feel. That is one of the stories that's attached, certainly in landscape photography. Now, it's undeniable that these observations about colour science, purple, mysterious and glamorous, so on, sadness and aloofness for the light blue, and hope and joy for yellow, these do exist in the real world in a sense. If you think about advertising, you can see this everywhere. So advertisements for fortune tellers and all of that sort of stuff are very often purple. You very often get that on the sort of shops that sell tarot cards and all of that stuff. Very often purple used in their marketing materials. Some of the other stuff draws on cultural resonance. There's also the factor of things that have happened to an individual, or things that an individual has experienced during their lifetime that they associate. So I think the argument with colour psychology is certainly that it is a thing. Colours do help to make people feel a certain way, and that there are some things that are observable for the majority of people the majority of the time. It certainly isn't an exact science. I think we'll pause it here. There's quite a lot of stuff to digest, and I've given a couple of hints about how this will be used in actual processing. But I think the question that's probably on everyone's lips around this is, yes, but how does all this actually affect my processing? What do I do to turn an average picture into a good picture, or what do I do to correct a real clashing, hideous colour arrangement? So what we're going to do in the next video, which will be out next week, is go through online. We're going to use DxO Photoshop, we're going to use Affinity, and we're going to use Lightroom to illustrate various points. Many of the controls are common across all three applications, so we'll get a good look, but the principle of it behind every part of the demonstration is how we use this tooling to affect, to imply, to inform our colour decisions when we're processing pictures. Okay, I hope this has been useful. Give us a tick down below if you've enjoyed the video, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Subscribe as well if you want an alert for the next one coming up. Okay, so yep, hopefully see you next week. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye now.